The next panel is a conversation with women in marine conservation. It's chaired by Associate Professor Kerry Fox Von Morton, who's from University. Thank you for making it over. I'll let you introduce the speakers, Kerry, but yeah, thank you all and enjoy.
We'll begin by acknowledging the traditional owners, the Turrbal and Yagara people. This is a beautiful building, but it's built on stolen lands, land that was never ceded. And in thinking about this session today and about marine science and marine social science and our previous panel, that the assumption is around Western academic knowledge systems and the way in which that marginalises Indigenous knowledge systems, and being mindful of that complexity in whether it be social science, whether it be the natural sciences, and how that impacts upon our work and how that might impact upon our First Nations brothers and sisters. And today especially, given the panel we're doing today, we're thinking about all those grannies and aunties and sisters, and for me here today, the Kerry Ruska, my friend and Gulnful woman, and Vivian Fisher, who is about to become my friend, as First Nations women, and acknowledging and paying my respects to First Nations people here, elders, past and present, and really a heartfelt thanks that I get for sharing this country with me. So today, my name is Kerry Fox Von Morton. I'm from Griffith University, amongst other places. My field is environmental and climate change communication, and my work centres around community-based research that engages coastal marine communities. Last night we launched this wonderful volume, shameless plug, which is an issue at Queensland Review about stories of, it's called Between Pride and Despair, Stories of Queensland's Great Barrier Reef and the Tropics Rainforest, and is about a humanities, creative arts and social sciences contribution to reef and rainforest debates. So that's what I did last night. So today we're going to be talking about women in marine science, and I have with me my three panellists, and we're just hoping to have a yarn and a conversation and just to stimulate some debate and discussion and share our stories, because one of the most powerful things that women can do in a world where women's stories and women's voices are often silenced is to tell our stories and be empowered through the telling of those stories. So let me, by way of hopelessly inadequate introduction, and you'll learn more about these women as conversation progresses. I'll start with Katie Walters. Katie Walters spent more than a decade managing community cultural development organisations before switching gears entirely and completing e-science in marine science. She achieved a first-class honours degree with an interdisciplinary project marrying these diverse practices, community engagement and marine science, then embarked on a PhD candidature with a specific focus on building community capacity for marine conservation and stewardship. Her interest in creating safe space for dialogue and finding common ground resulted in a highly successful limited series podcast featuring some of the unique and passionate people who love the Moreton Bay Coast as part of this research. Katie was the Communications Officer for the Society for Conservation Biology Marine Section from 2017 to 2020 and served on the marketing team for the International Marine Conservation Congress in Kuching, Malaysia in 2018. She's recently joined the team at Mountain Bay Foundation as a Community Partnerships Officer. Thanks, Katie, for coming along. Yolanda Waters is a dive instructor turned environmental and marine social scientist, community organiser and ocean advocate. She is currently completing her PhD with the Queensland University of Technology and the University of Queensland. Yolanda's research explores pathways to greater public engagement with climate action within the context of the Great Barrier Reef, and is particularly interested in the effects of social and educational experiences above and below the water, and exploring the diverse connections between people and the reef. Yolanda is an active member of the social science community for the Great Barrier Reef, and the current coordinator of the community-led initiative Divers for Climate. And finally, last but not least, Deb Anderson is an academic and journalist based in Melbourne. She grew up in North Queensland and gravitates back there a lot for work, family and the love of wild places. Deb spent almost 2 decades working with the quality press in Australia and overseas, principally on issues of education and science for the age, before she joined Monash University. Her research focuses on life narratives, using oral history to understand the ways ordinary people live with environmental risk over time, and how the past shapes present interpretations of social resilience. This uniquely collaborative approach has enabled partnerships with communities in various parts of Australia, out bush, up north, in the desert, out at sea, including creating an oral history collection with Museum Victoria and authoring Endurance, Australian Stories of Drought. Under a Monash Research Excellent Fellowship, she has been reporting stories of loss and renewal in communities affected by tropical cyclones for the National Library. That's this amazing papers about mould. I just can't get the mould thing in my head. And with me, she's using the State Library of Queensland and John Oxley Library Fellowship to document the vast and extraordinary ways that women from all walks of life have helped protect the Great Barrier Reef. What a panel. So thank you all for being here. Wonderful. Let me kick things off by asking all of you how you describe your relationship with the marine environment, and were there any critical moments in that relationship that you can recall? Katie, can you start?
How would I describe my relationship? Okay, those two questions marry up in my case. I had a bit of a transformative moment when I took a 6-month, took 6 months of my undergrad marine science to do an exchange in British Columbia. And the reason I chose British Columbia was because they had this cool subject called ethnoecology, and I hadn't heard anything about it. But I had worked in community cultural development with a strong focus on social justice, and I thought this was really cool. So I went over there, didn't realise that in Canada they don't have a tradition of mature age students. So I was by far the oldest human on the planet on campus, I'm sure. At least I felt that way. But I sat in those classes learning about a different way of being in the world, a different understanding of the world. One that didn't include silos of law over here and science over here and humanities over here and everything else. It was a knowledge practice complex where everything married up, and it was all centred on the place in which people were. And because I was there and I was on my own and I was lonely, and I would walk around Cadborough Bay into, looking at harbour seals and what have you. And I was thinking about kin centricity, which was another new concept that I had not been exposed to before, which kin centricity, if you haven't heard that term either, is about seeing all parts of the environment and the world around us as family, kin, members of kin. And so I started in my head imagining what that would be like. So I'm looking at ravens and harbour seals and thinking about them as if they were my cousin or my brother, and what they had to teach me, and the implied responsibility that I then had to them. And that practice of imagining the world that way completely transformed my experience of the environment and my relationship with it. And has led me down this path where I'm all in for conservation in that ontology, not in the let's save this as a thing separate to people, but let's do the right thing as members of a family with the world around us. Is that really long? Sorry.
That's fantastic. There's moments when, you know, when your frameworks and your taken for granted assumptions, you know, begin to shake beneath your feet a little bit, you know, and you go, oh, wow, I haven't thought of it like that. So a wonderful critical moment. How about you, Ellen?
Yeah, my relationship with the ocean's a bit complicated. It's not like a natural thing for me to love the ocean and to want to be there. I grew up terrified of the water, actually. I grew up on the Central Coast, so it's like a coastal town north of Sydney. Everyone there is a beach person. You know, every kid's in Sunday nippers. Everyone surfs. I can't surf to save my life. There's family photos of us, you know, where all my siblings are so happy to be near the beach, and I'm like, why am I here? I was scared of waves, seaweed, sharks, fish, name it. I didn't want to go in there. So how I'm sitting on this panel today, if you talk to me, like 8-year-old me should be like, no. Who are you? But weirdly enough, so my dad was a dive instructor when he was younger, and he was like, you've just got to get under the water, you'll be fine. And I was like, that's the worst idea ever. But it worked. I was like 13, and I went on my first underwater dive, which, like many people, your first underwater experience is quite transformative. And for me, it was like I think I was lucky. It was a beautiful day. It was clear water. It was sunny, and the animals just were maybe extra friendly that day. But there were like gropers that were like puppy dogs. You know, I did hide behind my instructor most of the time, but and I saw just like a cuttlefish. I'd never seen a cuttlefish in my life, and I think I was like, okay, everything under here is not going to swallow me. And like Katie was saying, this is looking at the marine world in a totally different way. Like you are a part of it all of a sudden, not on top of it. You're one with it, and you're just there. They don't care what you're doing. You're not the center of their world anymore. And I'm not saying like, I wouldn't say that transformed me completely. And I was like, yes, love the ocean. Like it's been a relationship I've had to work on, like all relationships, I suppose. But like there are still times where I'm still scared of the ocean. It still scares me. And now I'm in the ocean a lot. I've worked a lot as like a dive instructor, and some days I'm like, I do not want to go in there today. And I'm always definitely not the most keen person to get in because it is scary. The ocean is huge. It is, you know, there are things that that would be able to eat you if they wanted to. They don't, but it's a place where you're quite vulnerable. And so yeah, that's my relationship with the ocean at the moment. It is a place where I love to be, and it does help me reset and kind of connect again, but it does terrify me. So, yeah.
So in both of your responses is that sense of kin-centricity, that overwhelming sense that you're not in charge, that, you know, you're in a place that all of a sudden, you know, you were so sure about your position in relation to the world, and then you go and open your eyes up underwater, and all of a sudden there's a certain amount of humility, right?
Yeah.
In that. And Deb.
Thanks, Kerry. Another way to shake the foundations of what you think you know about the world is to have a child. And so if we're going to talk about what is the dominant factor in my life, it's actually my 4-year-old. And so I think that being a parent, a caregiver, somebody whose job it is to guide this little person, at least for the first while in his life, that certainly dominates the way that I think about everything. So I'd put that up front first. And I see some young people over here in the audience, and I'm really interested to know how and why they're here too, actually, on that note. But yeah, I think it's really important to record people's stories, and that's the thing that motivates a lot of the work that I do, both academic and non-academic work. I was privileged in growing up in a really beautiful place in far north Queensland on the edge of World Heritage Tropical Rainforest. And the reef and the rainforest are very much interconnected. But I grew up in an agriculture, right? It was about farming. And then as I got older, it was about the reef as an icon of tourism. And so the marine environment was a place to be visited. It was something that was a source of economic prosperity for the region. Like, you know, there's a really strong way of thinking about that marine environment that I grew up accepting, and then went away and actually came here to study at UQ many years ago. That changed my way of thinking. And so even just listening to the panelists here, I'm listening to Katie's ways of thinking and articulating your relationship, and it's so articulate. And then kind of your, I guess, like kind of visceral kind of experience and that fear. And so I immediately switch into, oh, I want to record that story. I want to record that story. I think there's so much that we could learn from each other by listening to other people and then being game enough to speak ourselves. So, yeah, I don't know if I've quite answered that question, but I guess through the work that I do, I feel like I'm in proximity to people whose relationship with the marine environment is really important to them, and I like to grapple with understanding that.
And I guess you're telling stories about people's relationship with
Yes.
their environment in
Yes.
ways that, you know, often, knowing your work, often disrupt, you know, the usual ways in which we tell those stories. One thing that struck me earlier on, and how complex that is, you know, and I know it wasn't intended, but the first speaker, Daniel Dunn, is that right? Wonderful, Daniel. You know, the idea that, I know it wasn't intended on your part, but the idea that modelling is complex, you know, like, and that's the hard science, and that all of this is soft, and, you know, it's all Mickey Mouse. Once you listen to, like, our First Nations panel and to the experience of these women, you start to see how hard this science is. I mean, physics is difficult until you try and communicate something to the public, and they won't sit still, and they talk back, and they have different ideas, and all of a sudden what was, you know, soft and easy becomes extraordinarily hard and complex. And as places in the social sciences where women have, you know, traditionally been overrepresented, entering those sorts of ideas into our discourse and reminding ourselves of how difficult this is, and working with our friends in the STEM disciplines is really critical work. And you're all doing that in some way or another, so that's wonderful. So how about your arrival on this panel, back to this panel? How did you get here? And what led you here? Just briefly, how did you come to be on this panel? Talk about your professional lives.
You're looking at me.
Well,
I'll start.
Okay.
May I be open for a moment? Kerry is my PhD supervisor, which means I'm sure that many of you will recognise that quite often she's my therapist as well. And I've also, you know, we mentioned that podcast that I did, and I realised when we were thinking about this before that I've asked many, many people as part of being a social scientist, what's your relationship with Moreton Bay? How have you come to be here? And I don't know that I've ever been asked some of these questions, like what is your relationship with it? So if I get emotional, that's why. And because I feel safe with Kerry, which is incredibly valued. Because when I was asked to be on a panel about women in marine conservation, I felt very challenged by that. I didn't feel comfortable with it. I'm a woman and I love that, and I'm in marine conservation and I love that, but representing a woman in marine conservation didn't sit well with me. I found that really difficult. I find that concept really difficult. And possibly because I spoke a little bit about seeing the world in a different way, with that knowledge, practice, belief, complex sort of system of understanding the world based in place, very personal relationship with the earth, and I find that super important in terms of how we might change things. I started my life in the arts in community cultural development, which is engaging with communities who have been disenfranchised and marginalised. The most recent of those was with a feminist circus organisation here in Brisbane, who I absolutely loved. And my experience of then switching to marine sciences it couldn't be more difficult. I came from a very collaborative safe spaces are everything, process is everything, to a confrontational, defend your thesis, reviewer number 1, 2, 3. Like, it's a completely different system of understanding the world. And so I realised that if I was going to look at capacity building, which is, in terms of changing the future of our environment, which we know is on a fairly frightening trajectory, I needed to kind of try to marry those two things up and pull myself out of thinking as a scientist and pull myself out of thinking as a feminist and start thinking about, I guess, I can't think about stakeholders anymore. I don't like to think about fishers and women and government and all these different bodies in that way. Now I'm trying to slice up, I guess, my interactions with people in a are you humble? Are you open? Are you willing to see things in a different way? Are you solutions based? Are you collaborative? Those are the slices of humanity that I see now, as opposed to men and women and fishers and conservationists and stakeholders in that way. So long story again, but it was because we talked this through and Kerry assured me that experience was as valid as any other as a woman in marine conservation, and that's why I'm here, because of you, basically. Your assurances.
Yeah, and I think that's really important that we acknowledge that there's more than one way to be a woman. There's different ways of being women in marine science and in the world generally, and I just really love that idea of not seeing stakeholders but seeing people who are, rather than seeing those categories, even though those categories are useful at times, working your professional life around who's prepared to be collaborative, who's prepared to be kind, who's prepared to be generous, and working with those and seeking them out as people who have that sort of baseline understanding of humanity.
Yeah, and I just to follow that up slightly is I would never want to suggest that it's not important to celebrate those differences, and to take a solid stance and say, I am a woman and I am this and I have had these experiences and this is unfair and it needs to change. All of those things are super valid and important. In an everyday working environment, I'm privileged that I'm able to just take that humanitarian stance as opposed to an identity stance.
It's interesting then, if you'll necessarily have those people who will take a stance as a part of your community, because they'll have that baseline of what's wonderful.
Sorry, I'm like processing what Katie's saying. No, I
How did you arrive here?
Sorry. How did I get here? My story is much shorter because I haven't been doing it for very long. I finished school and had no idea what I wanted to do. So if you guys don't know what you want to do, that's so normal. And so I went and did a genetics degree thinking genetics is cool. Turns out you have to do programming and lab work, and I hated it. And then I switched to environmental studies because they had lots of field trips. So I went there, and then by the time I got to my honours year, it was when the reef restoration program was starting up in Cairns, and it was in the news a lot, it was in the media. I was like, that's something that looks interesting. And so I was lucky enough to get a supervisor who was like, okay, you can do a project on that, like let's come up with something. And so I ended up interviewing a lot of the people involved in creating that program. And I didn't really know anything about the reef or reef conservation at the time at all. I just wanted to say that I was doing something like that at the time. And then after interviewing all these people, they were like, yeah, reef restoration, it's this really useful tool. It's going to be really great for the reef, but it doesn't work if we don't address climate change. And person after person was like, we need to address climate change. So I was like, okay, what are we doing about it? And then I started going down that rabbit hole and really getting into climate action, what's happening at different levels, especially up on the reef, and really noticing that nothing's really happening. So I kind of took an extended gap year/years to go and travel and dive, and that's when I did my dive instructors, and I spent quite a lot of time working in dive tourism in Cairns and Indonesia, and just kind of being around people who love the ocean. And if you meet these communities, they love the water and they're so passionate about protecting the ocean, but their passion goes a certain way. So plastic pollution, everyone's very excited about stopping that, which is great. Things that are quite visible, like stopping like turtle conservation, shark conservation, those kinds of really visible ocean conservation things are very popular. If you go to Gili T in Indonesia, like they sell shark conservation like dive courses like crazy, because everyone's like, yes, the ocean's beautiful, I love it, I've seen it, and they jump into those things. And I was like, this is so much passion for the ocean, but very rarely did I hear anyone talk about climate change. Even like the opposite, you get people going, oh, is it actually warming? Like, or they hear coral bleaching and they go, oh, shark conservation, which in the end it is all interconnected, but there was a gap. And I was really noticing it, especially as I kind of became like really familiar with those groups and like friends with a lot of them on social media. That whole space, the marine space and the climate space, is very separate. And then I did some looking around. I found my wonderful supervisor, Angela Dean, who's sitting in the back there. If you want to talk about collective action, ocean, go have a chat to her later. So I found her and I was like, here's some questions that I've got about this gap that's happening. And she was like, actually, we're just doing some work on that. People don't connect it. People don't connect the reef and climate action, especially at an individual level. And so that's where my PhD was born, which is about using the reef as like an icon to engage people with climate change and climate action, which is quite a complex, political topic, so it's hard to engage people. And so that's kind of my research at the moment. I'm like 2 years in. And on top of that, so the PhD is way slower than I thought it would be. So I got really frustrated, and like the reef is running out of time, not gonna like sugarcoat it, it's running out of time. So I was getting really frustrated, and COVID puts everyone, you're on your phone a lot. I don't know about you guys, but I'm on social media a lot, and you're just constantly scrolling, right? And all I was seeing was that gap just got amplified for me. Like, why is no one talking about this? The environmental kind of activists and climate activist community, they were on climate, but your ocean community was on all these ocean issues, but there was this gap, and I was like, this is... And a lot of kind of at this time, and before this as well, but a lot of constituency-based climate groups have been popping up all over the globe, really. So it's like identity-based. Started with the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. You've got Parents for Climate, Farmers, Vets for Climate. You said Plumbers for Climate before. There's footy players for climate, surfers for climate. There's all these kind of identity-based groups popping up, which are fantastic because they, it's really one of those gaps in like, Kerry, maybe you can speak to this more about communicating about climate change is connecting with people, finding common ground, and those groups are really awesome. But I was like, where's the divers for climate? Where is this ocean group? I mean, surfers is getting there, but they really focus on like the coastline. And I was like, where's our underwater advocates? So I made one with a group of people. So there's a Divers for Climate now, and then for the last year and a half, we've been running that. And we're just a community group, we're volunteers, and we facilitate conversations that bring the ocean world and the climate world together. So we hold panels, we bring speakers, it's all online. We kind of platform other groups and what people are doing just to make sure those really nuanced climate conversations are making their way into this ocean world. Because they are interested, there's just this gap that needs bridging. And that is, I'm here.
Is there a Facebook group for that?
Instagram.
Okay. Join you.
We're on Facebook too, but
plug it.
So what I really like about your story, not only that you told it, was that, there's this, in the 70s, amongst feminism, there's this idea that the personal is political. Yeah. And I like the way in which your private life of diving and, has become so much a part of your public life and your, and in undertaking that, and it doesn't always need to be stated, and it doesn't always need to be something that, you have to be a card-carrying feminist. But it is a statement about women. It is a statement that's about the power of women in our society. So it's just really wonderful to hear how you've arrived. And it doesn't matter whether you're at the beginning stages of your career or at the later stages, which may well start describing me pretty soon. that's really an important contribution to how we understand women's participation in marine science. So thank you. Deb, waiting patiently there.
I think building on what you're saying, Kerry, and also some of the things that you've just said, I'm more and more profoundly interested in feminism and what it means for me the older I get. And so that's really drives a lot of the work that I do now. And so I was heavily pregnant, sitting at a reef research workshop, we can call it that, at Magnetic Island. I had privilege of being involved in an event, and Kerry was sitting there. I don't know exactly what we're talking about, but it brought together ideas of gender and environment, and you mentioned this idea that you'd had to document the many different ways that women have been involved in forms of environmental leadership that might not be recognised as such around the Great Barrier Reef. And so got involved in that project, and through the State Library of Queensland Fellowship that we've been working on for a couple of years now, had the privilege of recording lots of women's stories about how they have been involved in advancing the protection of the Great Barrier Reef, fighting advocacy for the reef, or perhaps the quieter voices, the domains that we might not think are necessarily related to marine conservation. So it's a space that I'm loving working in myself, because I'm really interested in the ways that women's voices, there's a profound ignorance around the roles that women have played in environmental leadership in this country. And so I think this is a way in to that, that hopefully can shine a light and also kind of generate like a broader project on environmental conservation and women's involvement in that in Australia. So that's how I got here, yeah.
And just linking, Jo's discussion around climate change and the Great Barrier Reef, there's been a number from the United Nations framework on climate change, Convention on Climate Change, a number of initiatives that have acknowledged the underrepresentation of women in climate change decision making, including their own, I think it's the Gender Action Plan, I've got that wrong. So, in undertaking these discussions about women's roles and what they have done, we amplify their voices, but we also give them authority, legitimacy and expertise in these discussions. And I guess that's the point of this panel, but also the point more specifically of the Women of the Reef project is to say that women have been very much a part of the reef's conservation and bring an expertise to the reef. So we've, Katie, you've already sort of spoken about whether or not, whether you figure yourself as a woman in marine conservation, and that was a beautiful response. Jo, do you think of yourself as a woman in marine conservation? Is that something you've thought about before, or are you thinking about it just now as I'm asking the question? Do you have any insights or any comments on being a woman?
Yeah, I feel like you can't not think about it. I feel I can't not think about it, because it's marine conservation sits in this space where if you had like a Venn diagram, you've got marine science and STEM, which is male dominated. You've got the dive industry, which is extremely male dominated. And then you've got also marine science and conservation, which I just was reading a paper before that female leaders are incredibly underrepresented. So you've got these really male, I guess that's the world, but these really specifically, these male-dominated industries, and you're always trying to, especially as a young woman in these spaces, trying to be taken seriously. And I'm always thinking of that every room I go into, and I'm really trying to challenge myself to go into rooms that look terrifying, because I feel like you have to fight a lot more to make yourself heard, not just heard, but be taken seriously, and so, yeah, you just can't not think about being a woman in those spaces, because it's just so in your face sometimes. And I think not even, for me, I would think about not just being a woman in these spaces, but being an Asian woman, especially marine conservation. Now, because of social media, it's easy to find people, and I've been able to find people that I wish I followed when I was younger. But if you look at a lot of the committees and boards and leadership teams of a lot of marine organisations, scientific, NGO, whatever, they're all mostly male dominated still, but even if there are a few women on it, they're very white. And for someone who where I grew up is also, it's not a particularly culturally diverse place. Everyone's blonde hair, blue eyes, loves the water. And so I didn't grow up seeing myself in this marine space. And I still don't see a lot of it. And I'm still quite white passing, you know, but I grew up with like a Chinese background. And so going into these spaces, I really noticed that as well. Not just Chinese women, but women of colour, Indigenous women. You still don't see a lot of it. But, you know, now with Instagram and social media and things, it's given people platforms that don't traditionally get platforms, which has been really, really great. You know, there's women, and we will talk about them later, that I now admire, and I wish I had them as role models growing up. You know, I wish I'd seen them. Maybe I could have seen myself in these spaces earlier. And yeah, so yeah, I do think about it.
Wow, that's an amazing response. I've got a lot of things going through my head about that, about how we need to see ourselves in roles. You know, that we need to have those role models, and in any meeting, whether you be whatever gender you subscribe to, you know, to take the effort to look at the young woman in the room and say, what do you think? You know, whoever's in the room, I don't care if it's, you know, whoever is, you know, distinguished, to make sure that, you know, we always take that opportunity to elevate women's voices if we find ourselves in a position to do so. And thinking about, you know, your Asian heritage, and seeing those role models, and again thinking about the previous panel and First Nations people who take on, and First Nations women like you do, who take on that leadership role, and how important it is for them to see role models, but also to be that role model, and the sort of responsibility that necessarily carries with it, to be able to see ourselves, you know, seeing and doing is still fundamentally, you know, connected. So thank you for sharing that. Deb.
Oh, I have to admit that what you're talking about now is one of the big things that motivates the work that I do, to actually to communicate that to the wider public, to, I guess, shed some light on the different ways of there are different ways of being a woman in the world. There are different ways of being a feminist. There are different ways of being an eco-feminist, and that variety of engagement, and I guess being able to be seen and be heard, so that people can identify with, just have a variety of role models, I think is really, really important, and that you can see a place for yourself. I think that's really important. Yes, I think that's how I'm involved in conservation, full stop, and then marine conservation is an aspect of that through a specific project that I'm working on. Yeah.
Right. And and so in the Women of the Reef, you know, knowing that there are moments in our interviews, so we've collected a dozen interviews so far, and there are moments where those women are amazingly supported, and all these people, you know, unite sort of beneath them to make sure that they can realise their ambition. I'm thinking particularly about Carden Wallace, principal scientist emeritus at Queensland Museum, and what happened when she was starting her career, and she had a small child, and she was collecting samples and taking them all over the world, and she had a small son, and her son's father and her mother-in-law, I want to say,
Parents-in-law,
you know, just came to support her, and she was away for 6 weeks when this child was quite young, and later on she was retelling the story to her daughter-in-law, and the daughter-in-law was sort of going, "What, you did that? You left your child for that long, a little baby for 6?" And she said, "Yeah, I did. You know, yeah, I did." And the only reason why she was able to do that really was the support of, because we live in communities, you know, we don't live on our own. So it's a beautiful story about carbon. So I'm just conscious of 10 minutes, thank you. So I'll just ask a quick question, and then hopefully we have time to ask some questions from the audience too. So the last question I'd like to ask, you know, in the light of
in the light of national discussions surrounding women's participation in Australian society. I'm thinking about, Grace Tame, Bridget Higgins, the Me Too movement. How do these national discussions about women in Australia translate to marine conservation or more broadly marine science? Do you see that these translate? Can you articulate how those national discussions translate to marine conservation and marine science? Over to you, Katie.
That one just came out of the blue, so I'm just, man. I guess, maybe wrapping up some of the things that I've said earlier as well about, and I'm trying to articulate, I hope you'll get that I'm trying to articulate this for myself as much as for this panel. But what you just said about some of those experiences and how in your face they are, and I don't want to minimise that and say that it hasn't happened for me, because even in the last 2 weeks, the amount of justification I have to do. And last year I was involved in a campaign with a partnership of other organisations, and I was talking about some framing messages in communication, and this fellow who was with another organisation had no experience in advocacy campaigns, had come in as basically a typeset or a design, he'd put together cookbooks. And he essentially questioned everything that I asked for, and he asked me if I would provide references. Like, can you send me those papers that prove what you're saying? And I just went, no.
Good on you.
And I guess what
Google it, mate.
Yeah, Google it, mate. That's exactly it. And I think that's a long way of answering that question, which is the thing that I'm very grateful for about this is that, well, combined with the fact that what we're doing is so urgent in environment stuff, that there's no time for that. I don't have time to justify myself to you, fella. I've got all this expertise. If you aren't willing to just be open and humble and hearing something new, then there's actually a ton of other people I can work with. And I'm so grateful for all of the women in here and all of the women who were at Friday's research panel, research showcase, because I know that you're all out there and there's all these social scientists out there, and this is what gives me hope. And I know one of the other things you talked about was who's your role model, and I go, all of you all give me hope. It's not the Sylvia Earles and it's not this great NOAA scientist and this other person. It's just people like you, Kerry, and my panellists and people here who I feel like, oh, thank God there are people who get it, and we have a path forward.
Yeah, I love what you said about I don't have time for it. There's a really good article. It's not about gender, it's about race, and I forget the title exactly, but it's by this lady, Ayana Elizabeth Johnson, and she's a marine biologist, but now like a climate policy person, and it's called like, I don't know what the title is, but it's like, can you like solve racism already so I can solve climate change? Because she's like, there's just, if you have to always explain yourself and kind of answer those questions about race or gender, and you're wasting your time. There's so many other things to be doing. So yeah, that's what it made me think of. So, but your question, I think, I don't really know how to answer it, but I think it's definitely, there's a lot of community groups now, thanks like being online, like Girls That Scuba, Women in Ocean Conservation, and they're huge online groups, they're global groups, and they're really showcasing the stories of women in these spaces that are very male dominated, and people are standing up a lot more. So I don't even know if like all the stuff in Australia was before or after. I think it's been happening for a while, it's been building up to this, and they're doing, Women in Ocean Science, they run regular surveys to see what women's experiences are, because a lot of time in the field, you're in swimwear, you're in wetsuits, people have a lot of messed up experiences on those boats, and getting out there. It's quite a difficult place and you've got on top of that the dive industry, which has its problems of its own. But women are kind of coming forward and coming together with these experiences, and I've seen that a lot. I don't know if I've just been tuning into it more lately, and it's why I'm seeing a lot more, but I do feel like it's progressing, if anything. In most respects, I have my stepmother, who was my first dive instructor. She works quite high up in one of the dive organizations, and the stories she has are shocking, even today. Like, she will get just completely judged and talked down to in meetings because she gets her nails done, stupid things like that. And they're like, how can you dive with long nails? And she's like, actually, I've been here longer than you. I know the water better than anyone. She knows her thing like no one else. But the story she has with her bosses, and like, so that kind of the things that she faces up at that level are that bad. Like, the things that happen down and to everyone else who are, you know, doing their field work or doing anything else, it's still, there's a long way to go. But I think people are slowly kind of being okay to talk about it now. I'm trying to get my stepmom to do it. We'll see.
Great, thanks, Jane.
I think it's a really good question about the kind of impact that the issues, the debate, the conversation around a young woman, a really strong young woman like Grace Tame, will have on marine conservation, but more broadly environmental awareness in this country. I think that's a really interesting question. It's something that we are posing to the women we're interviewing for the Women of the Reef project, and there is a variety of responses. And I find that so interesting. I mean, in some of the research that I've done in rural communities up in North Queensland, not for the Women of the Reef project, but other oral history-based projects, I've had women say, you know, I can't believe the things that Grace Tame did to ScoMo. Like, there's that, you know, and I can't personally relate with that response, but it's my job as a researcher to seriously sit and listen and try to understand where she's coming from, try to contextualise, try to allow her to be heard, and also maybe piece together parts of that background, that context, that story that can help us understand and help us actually start a conversation about that. And then, you know, at another extreme, in interviewing Women of the Reef, you know, there are women who absolutely can see the connection and will speak with courage about that, and don't need to step back from it, right? And so, I guess I think it's a job of a researcher to be in that space, to hear the many different ways of responding to that question. As somebody who's worked in the news media, I'll also always say that there's a big role for the news media to play here, and there's a big role for us as news consumers to play too. You know, we need to think very carefully about the media we consume, and we need to curate that, and we need to educate ourselves about, you know, whose sources are they relying upon in telling the stories that we might scroll through. So, yeah.
And I guess when we started off speaking about another person who's political, you know, women's experiences happen locally. You know, it's locally. It might be diving. It might be, you know, through your work as a community campaigner. It might be work with, you know, as a journalist or encountering Women of the Reef. We encounter these issues every single day. So it does become, as you know, frustrating and tiresome. Some days you go, oh, you know, do I have to again sort of restate my expertise and my professionalism and my authority in these circles? And that does become quite tiresome. But it happens locally, and they are indications of a broader structures for women of all types, be they First Nations, be they ones of Asian heritage, be they older or younger generations, you know, across the entire spectrum. And they are things that we impact in our everyday lives, but also have the power to impact the entire system through how we act and respond to each other. And I think that that it's just been wonderful to hear your stories. I'd also say, I feel bad, Daniel, about we'll talk later, but I just really wanted to say to you and to all of the people who are not women present, that this feminism isn't about women. Feminism is about us all like benefiting from when we allow that 51% of the population its fullest expression, its fullest, capacity to contribute to issues like climate change and to help us, preserve those marine and coastal environments because, we love a sunburnt country, we love these environments. And so on that note, I don't think I've got time for questions, do I?
Maybe just one question. I don't want to give no questions, but we should go to lunch shortly.
Yes, please. Sure. Thank you. That was a wonderful panel. Thank you so much. I'm attempting to dip my toe in the social sciences water, but I come from quite a quantitative conservation background. And I think I don't want to speak to every woman in the quant space's experiences, but I definitely went through a phase where I was, very like, I'm not like other girls. I love maths and, all that sort of to fit in kind of thing. And I wonder, I don't want to ask you about issues you've had with women in the quantitative spaces. I'd rather ask, are there things that we can do as women in like an adjacent field, all working in conservation? Are there ways that we can support women who are in the social sciences spaces better to sort of, to what Daniel was saying, hop on your bus and work together better? Like, how can we be better advocates for your science in our spaces?
I did some interviews with scientists a while ago on the investigator, the RV investigator, the Cyroceans. And I was asking them their experiences of communications and whether they, and you're not supposed to go in with a preconceived idea of what, you want your answers to be or anything like that. But I kind of thought that that all scientists should be doing communications. And having spoken to scientists in those interviews, they were terrified. They are terrified of that. A lot of the ones that not all of them, some of them were absolutely, whole range of responses. But there were a number who were going, there was one university who actually enforced a thing of they all had to have Twitter. All their academics had to have a Twitter account. And she said, if they force me to be on that, I'll quit. And I was like, fair go, okay. I think maybe we don't all have to be everything. And maybe that's what my response would be, is that humility that we talked about. They're not trying to slice, this field is hard and this is soft and this is, but actually to just go, holy wow, there's there is real benefit in that. And there is real benefit in that. And I would hope, and my professional practice, I guess, is to try to inspire the connections between people. And there's a role for that, the connector as well, and value in the connector rather than the doer and the doer and the doer. And so I hope that connections are the things that to look for rather than, hey, you've got to develop my skills, or I've got to develop your skills, or let's not do that. That's too hard.
Or worse, that we're the wacky sideshow.
Yeah.
To the serious science of,
Yeah.
And we're put on as something that, will get the grant over the line because isn't that funky, but, we're taken seriously for our contribution. Yeah?
Oh, no, I was just going to say that not all social science is qualitative. Some of it is quantitative. And I struggle with it. So to support, it could help with statistics if anyone's offering. But no, basically what Katie said, like connecting people and sharing skills, because there's so many, social science is so many disciplines and so many quantitative and qualitative skill sets. So just kind of connecting and kind of, if you've got something, so I know like in the talks later, there'll be people with lots of different kind of research superpowers is what we're calling them. So like just different areas you could help if someone needs it. So if I need help with like R, I'm like, hello, somebody. And yeah, like to what Daniel said earlier, like if you do want to support social sciences, incorporate them early on. Not as like a side thought, same with, your Indigenous perspectives. It has to be incorporated from the planning stage, and instead of, like the sideshow.
And I guess building on that, I'm not sure what's available here at UQ, but I know in the university context I work in down south at Monash, I think there is a real push for cross-disciplinary work, and to think about that early and to start building relationships, trusted relationships. And so we're having like lots of these kind of cross-university, cross-faculty networking opportunities. Unfortunately, no one's ever got any time for this, right? And it always happens in the the break between teaching semesters or whenever it is that we are desperate to get out in the field and do our research. So I think that there's some teething problems with these processes, but just taking the opportunity to go along and meet people and develop that relationship. And then those things, they kind of organic, they can work from the ground up. And you won't end up in the situation where one or the other feels like it's the appendix to the main project. Yeah, but I really appreciate that question. Yeah, and both ways, like to be able to do that.
We need to keep asking ourselves. I feel that if I'm dealing with people who do quantitative statistics, I go, gee, what? And why are you squaring it? Like I have no idea. And so there is a certain intellectual humility and humanity. That it's not all of us or one of us. It's together us, and that's the way forward. Before, I think that's all we've got time for. But can I just ask you to it took a lot of courage and to share those stories and to be so open and so wonderfully engaging about your experiences and your expertise. So from all of us, thank you very much to my panel.